From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you. Today, K-State's Ignacio Ciampitti will talk about the complications for you corn and soybean growers brought on by the relentless wet field conditions in much of Kansas. That'll include what to think about when considering replanting part or all of a field. Also today, from the latest podcast out of the Kansas Forest Service here at K-State, considerations on harvesting trees from one's land for milling into lumber, given the current state of the lumber market. Featured are the service's Dave Bruton and Cassie Wandersee and commercial sawmill operator Tom Hogard. And later on this week's horticulture segment, K-State's Ryan Armburst on controlling those bagworms on landscape ornamental trees and shrubs. All that and more next on Agriculture Today.
Make hand washing a healthy habit everywhere you go. Wash your hands with soap and water for at least 20 seconds, especially after going to the bathroom, before, during, and after preparing food, and before eating. If soap and water aren't available, use a hand sanitizer that has at least 60% alcohol. Life is better with clean hands. A message from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention.
You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, our Thursday edition. As all of you producers in Kansas are well aware, we've had more than ample moisture in a large part of the state in the last 2 weeks plus, and that has complicated spring planting and early emergence of those crops that were sown before the fields got soaked up. We'll talk about adjusting to all of that now. Along with us once more via phone is crop production and cropping systems specialist Ignacio Ciampitti of K-State Research and Extension. Well, Ignacio, let's start on the corn side of the ledger here. Most of the corn has been put in the ground, but the problem now is lack of emergence and poor doing stands because of overly soaked soils.
Yeah, thanks as always, Eric, for the invitation. As you mentioned, almost close to 3/4, I would say 76% was our last update on planting progress for corn across the state. So we still have some corn that needs to be planted. One of the current challenges is these issues on the rains that are coming every 2 or 3 days. So sometimes the soils are so charged with soil moisture that having another small rain again delays the planting and delays the planting for in many situations 2 or 3 days, and then the sequence starts again, we get another rain. So there are two different scenarios. I mean, we can discuss about these situations. I mean, for those guys that they didn't plant it yet, in the situation of what are the concerns on planting, and then for those lucky ones, if we want to say that they already planted that corn, that in many situations the saturation is an issue. What basically is impacting is the root growth. I mean, we are start seeing that the plants are just not growing fast. Cooler soil temperatures are really not helping, I mean, the development of the greenness. But we start seeing some pictures of this, like yellow leaves that they indicate really a slow photosynthesis, a slow plant growth. We have seen in a few situations, not too many to be honest, this year at least, purple colorations. Usually we tend to see more purple colorations when we have cold nights. But in some situations, if that is the minimum impact, if you go to the field and you see just only yellow leaves and the plants are still not doing much, no worries. I mean, the recovery is in many situations with no impact in yields. If the plants are staying alive and once the conditions return to be more kind of a normal, then most likely what we will start seeing is it will be a compensatory growth. And we have experienced that situation a couple of years in the past where heat is starting to turn on and then the plants start basically rushing through all the growth stages. I think that we will be experiencing potentially a similar condition. By mid-June, we will start seeing high temperatures, and then most likely those plants will start growing quite fast. Some of the consequences of these problems that could cause by saturated soil conditions, we might see those impact late in the season when this lack of root development or poor root establishment, once we start going into the vegetative stages where the plant has more height and biomass, B5, B6, B8, A leaves. If the root system is very shallow, those plants will become very susceptible to any high winds conditions. So just to provide some word of caution there.
Are there any scenarios that you're seeing in the field or that you expect are out there, Ignacio, where replanting that corn would be a more viable option than trying to ride it out with that current weak stand?
Yes, excellent question, Eric. We have at least a few fields I have visited, and then we have situations where the target population was 28,000, but we are seeing between 5,000 or 10,000 plants only. In those situations, when we are seeing less than 50% of the stands, I think that the message is clear. And in many situations, if you see that large stand reductions, my recommendation would be just to go back. Most likely, we might need to kill that section of the field that basically we have poor germinations and then replant. In many situations, if we are doing it right now, we might stay with the same CRM and maturity without changing it. If we are going a little bit on 2 weeks or farther on planting dates, we might start thinking about basically reducing the maturity just to make sure that we can finish the crop before freeze at the end of the season.
Ignacio, on the soybean side, it's largely a case of planting delays for way too many producers out there. Some do have their new stands in the ground, but in either case, these conditions are not ideal for that crop either.
Yeah, you're exactly right. I mean, in the situation of soybeans, as you mentioned, we have the two scenarios or the two kind of different conditions. Those stands that are already on the ground, and then the situation for those stands are connected more when the plants are submerged. And if the plants are really underwater for less than 48 hours, no problem. If it's less than 48 hours, those plants can survive. I think that we'll have very good chances that we might see potential minimum impact or not that much impact when the plants are already up. Let's go to the other scenario now. What happens if you just got planted? So for germination, when the soils are saturated during germination, they can really reduce the stands. And then we might see, for example, in some situations up to 50% stand reductions. And then that could be a big, big issue. In those cases, I mean, saturation really has a lot of injury. In many situations, some people will ask us, okay, what are the critical factors for saturated soils? And of course, as a really good agronomist, we always answer, it depends. How long is the saturation? If the saturation is for at least 48 hours, really we are seeing that can decrease the germination roughly around 50%. It could be between 30 and 70%. If it's less than that, 24 hours or less, which it could be a case in many situations, we are seeing less and less impact. And maybe we have some impact, but it will be only just 20% on potential impact on final plants. And I think that one of the main points to discuss right now is that, similar as we discussed before, replanting. And again, we need to start thinking about all the potential consequences of these issues of waterlogging. We have already seen issues, for example, of Pythium or Phytophthora or Rhizoctonia. So we need to be careful that it's not just the water effect and the stress for excess of water, but we might see that issues of plants that are not germinating because consequence of another factors, that the seed treatments are not becoming effective at some point. I mean, and the plants, if they were really long staying there in the field, those seed treatments don't become effective. And then we start seeing a lot of lack of uniformity in the field. And our rule of thumb is kind of as similar as we discussed in corn. We have seen some fields that they have at least more than 30 or 40% of the stand reduction. So if the target was 120,000 and we are seeing those fields with 60 or 70,000, close to 40, 50%, we know that the soybeans could compensate, but the ability to compensate on those really poor stands is really low. And the other challenge that we might experience is also the problems that, or consequence of these issues are connected to weed control, because we are opening a lot of resources and space for weeds to colonize many, many places in the field, and weed control could become a nightmare. So This lack of uniformity will come back and will be hunting us the next coming weeks and months. So really keep an eye, look at sections of the field that they have problems, and if they are really contiguous sections of acres, think about very carefully about the needs of replanting. We are, fortunately for soybeans, we have a very nice window for planting, and they can catch up very quickly.
And again, with soybeans, one might have more latitude in as far as the maturity group they're going with. They might well be able to, producers, stay with their original maturity group as opposed to going to a shorter season variety.
Yeah, and one of the recommendations that we say, which is similar to when we discussed, remember, many times about late planting soybeans, we talk about this idea of potentially not changing the maturity group until we are really too late. Mm-hmm. And when it's really too late is when we start getting after mid-June, and in many situations it's even when we are at the end of June. We don't want to really decrease or reduce the season length, and we want to make sure that that plant has enough vegetative nodes so we can have enough pods. Sometimes we have the problem that if we shorten out for a really short maturity group, we finish with very small plants with really small number of nodes, and then we compromise the yields. So again, keep in mind these factors, when you're taking those decisions, but I think that we still are on time. Evaluate, this is an excellent moment just to go out to everything that has been planted and start looking at the stands and make the assessment about the quality and uniformity in those stands.
Incidentally, if you check out the very latest Agronomy E-Update newsletter out of K-State, which will be posted later on this afternoon, Ignacio touches on these very topics in much more detail. So have a look, agronomy.ksu.edu. Well, Ignacio, we'd like to have you back tomorrow on the broadcast and at that time talk about planting management considerations for grain sorghum. Until then, many thanks for the comments right here.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Eric, and it's always a pleasure.
He's Ignacio Ciampitti, crop production, cropping systems specialist, K-State Research and Extension. We'll be back with more for you after this break. You're listening to Agriculture Today.
For information on threatening weather, you should depend on the National Weather Service and their broadcast on NOAA Weather Radio. NOAA Weather Radio is an all-hazards radio network that provides up-to-the-minute weather information, including life-saving warnings anytime, day or night. NOAA Weather Radio also broadcasts information on man-made disasters, such as chemical spills, amber alerts, or other national emergencies. For the National Weather Service, I'm Bill Curtis.
Agriculture Today continues now. Well, even if you haven't made a trip to the lumber yard in a while, you producers are probably well aware that lumber prices have soared to the stratosphere this year. And this has more than a few landowners thinking about harvesting their own trees and having them milled into lumber, either for their own construction purposes or for marketing. Well, the two featured guests on the latest Kansas Forest Service podcast have been on the receiving end of a wave of questions, they say, from farmers and ranchers about utilizing their own timber as a lumber source. And right here we have some highlights from that enlightening discussion. This among K-State Utilization and Marketing Forester Dave Bruton, a portable sawmill operator from Northeast Kansas, Tom Hogard, and Kansas Forest Service Communications Coordinator Cassie Wandersee, guiding the dialogue.
Talking about having these portable mills on site, how have you seen, just increased prices at the lumber yard affecting the demand for milled lumber? And has that changed, Tom? There are a lot of people trying to build structures with milled lumber.
I get that call in the last 2 or 3 months. I get that call probably 5 times a week. And I got 2 of them yesterday. And there are concerns about building with native woods. Some states actually have laws that permit the building with native woods. If it's your property and you're building it and it's your trees and you mill it, in some states, I think Wisconsin has a native wood law. I think a couple other states have that. But for Kansas, in most cases, home construction or a human-occupied structure, in most cases, requires that the lumber be dried, graded, and certified for use for its intended purpose. There are a few places around in Kansas, I've run into one in the last week or so, in counties where they do not require conformance with building codes. And so you can build, you could take green lumber, cut your own trees down, have somebody mill it for you, and build it out of your own lumber. You can do that. I do strongly recommend, even if you don't have to comply with building codes, if you read the Uniform Building Code, there's a lot of good information in there that may prevent problems down the road. For example, what spans you can have, how big a piece of lumber it takes to span a certain distance and things like that. But you can, in some locations, build with your own wood. Under that, we are primarily a hardwood forest area. And so most people build their homes using softwood lumber, usually SPF, spruce pine fir type of things. And that's normally what is graded, and that's the spans and stuff are all based upon that type of lumber. And most hardwoods, most of them are going to be stronger than that, but some are not. And you really need to look closely at the type of lumber. There are difficulties with building with hardwood, like oak 2x4s is going to be a different process than a pine 2x4 as far as nailing into it without splitting it. The other thing is the lumber should be dry, especially if you are building with enclosed spaces. Like if you have interior wall coverings, if you build with green lumber, you'll get mold in the walls because the wood's going to give off its moisture. It's going to come into equilibrium with whatever the atmosphere is. And some of our woods, a common one requested for like making 2x4s to build something is cottonwood. It's our most voluminous wood in the state of Kansas, as far as I know. Is that right, Dave?
I believe that's still true, yes.
And it's often used for utility type purposes. And it's not a high demand wood for woodworkers, but somebody might say, I've got a lot of cottonwood trees, I can build a house. And cottonwood can have more water in it than when it's fresh cut, can have more moisture in the board than the board when it's dry would even weigh. I mean, it has moisture contents above 100%. And if you don't get that out of there before you enclose your wall and put your sheetrock up, you'll get mold inside the walls.
That is an important point to drive home, I guess, is, whenever somebody contacts me about building something for structural purposes, now for trim and flooring and all those sorts of things, that's outside of this realm. But anything that's going to be structural and help support the building, they need to contact their county building code type office to find out whether they are under those requirements or not. And what I have found, there are several counties in the state, as Tom mentioned, that don't require anything, and there are more and more that are starting to adopt those. And usually what I find, it's those counties that are becoming more populated. I mean, nobody wants their house that they're building, to fall in, and it's usually the more populating counties that have the building inspectors and the enforcement of that. And so anybody that's wants to build, anything structural from their native woods, I would encourage them to contact their respective counties, because we could say something today and it not be true tomorrow if a county adopts that. And so it's always good to try to get the most current information at the time of planned construction. And, I look back, all the old barns, or a lot of the old barns that are scattered across the landscape, and you look back at the, old houses and those sorts of things, we really have lots of our native woods, in those barns. Lots of barns will have walnut beams and, walnut lumber in there. And walnut is really decay resistant and holds up well. I've seen lots of cottonwood barns, that are out there, and they've survived well over 100 years. And so, as Tom mentioned, it's not that the woods, the hardwoods, aren't going to be supportive, but basically during the kind of the inspection process, if you do live in one of those counties where they have building codes and the lumber has to be inspected, as far as I know, there's nobody in the state. We don't have an inspector, a hardwood lumber inspector for structural purposes in the state. Now, there are some architects, I believe, that can put a stamp on things, but basically they're looking for knots and defects and things like that are in the wood, visual type inspection that kind of assures that the lumber is solid and sound and going to support for the purpose that it's being put in there for. But, obviously, if you have big knots in the wood, if you have big decay points or rot in there, then those boards are going to be more defective and not supportive that way. So that is important to make sure people are aware, of their building codes in their counties and make sure they follow those steps.
I think one of the things that's driving it recently is I had an article I received this morning. Since April of 2020, wholesale lumber prices for construction lumber has gone up 437%, according to this National Home Builders Association study. And that's why a lot of people are out looking. The fact is that under normal circumstances, pretty much all of the hardwoods that Kansas property owners would have are more valuable if milled than the lumber that they would buy to build their house. A lot of normal price for construction lumber, you might find 2x4s and stuff at a figure of maybe 75 cents a board foot. And it's not likely that there's much timber in Kansas, hardwood timber, that milled and dried wouldn't be worth at least twice that, if not 10 times that. So it's just one of those things that I think people have panicked because they wanted to build something this year and the prices are extremely high. And so I've got trees and that's the next step. But by the time you take the trees down, mill the trees, stack it, dry it, prep it for use, and use it, I wouldn't be surprised if the prices don't moderate somewhat and go back down.
Yeah, and I think the lumber prices will moderate over time. It's going to take time in coming down. And, basically it's a matter of the supply and demand is what's driving this. And, over time, the sawmills will probably catch up with the demand that's out there, and the demand may start dropping off if interest rates start going up. And so, like I say, it was kind of a perfect storm that we ran into this past year with COVID and people being off on how they thought things were going to be handled. And so I expect things will probably moderate over time.
So it sounds like maybe there's an opportunity even to expand milling in Kansas if those hardwoods are that valuable. So do you see the potential for that sawmill industry to expand within the state?
I actually do. There are more and more people, I think, like Tom out there with the smaller portable type mills and the smaller mills that are providing a much needed service. And with transportation costs being I always say transportation costs are a killer with forest products because, if you're having to haul stuff further, say you lose a mill and the next market is another 100 miles down the road, well, that's less money basically, or you lose value in your timber that way because that tree becomes less valuable because you're having to spend more in the dollar to get it to the market. If we've got mills scattered across the landscape, they're able to service those people better and be closer and in the local communities. And so that's kind of been a nice thing to see, is more and more of those sorts of things. And several people on our list of sawmills, one thing I would encourage people to do is on our list of sawmills is to check that out. We've got several people have nice websites that they can click on and give them ideas on things to make and the services that they provide.
From the Kansas Forest Service, Dave Bruton and Cassie Wandersee, along with commercial sawyer Tom Hogard. Really good perspectives on harvesting and utilizing homegrown timber for lumber on this podcast. Take it all in by searching for Kansas Forest Service Podcast. We'll be back with more on Agriculture Today.
With the shortage of primary care physicians, especially in rural areas, health education and disease prevention are vital. K-State research and extension programs address quality of life, personal development, and health behaviors across all life stages of all social economic groups. To learn more about health education, one of K-State Research and Extension's 5 grand challenges, visit www.ksre.ksu.edu.
We're back now on Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you, and next up, today's agricultural news headlines for you, these courtesy in part of DTN. The Republican members of the Senate Agriculture Committee are calling on USDA Secretary Tom Vilsack to make a detailed explanation public, as well as any supporting economic analyses that would clarify how the Biden administration's proposed tax increases would affect farm estates. The panel's ranking member, John Boozman of Arkansas, authored a letter to Vilsack that questioned the USDA's analysis of the president's proposed changes in capital gains tax rates and the modification to stepped-up basis on family farms and ranches. The letter specifically asks for an explanation of how the USDA arrived at the conclusion that 98% of farm estates would not be impacted by the proposed tax changes. The senators wrote that the tax impacts are dependent on a number of factors, including but not limited to appreciation in farmland assets prior to a property owner's death, the size of the farm operation and associated assets, the income of the heirs, and the farm's ownership structure. Given these factors, they're writing to seek a detailed explanation and the supporting analyses clarifying how those tax provisions would affect farm estates, including specifically how the USDA arrived at that conclusion that fewer than 2% of farm estates would be impacted by the proposed tax changes. Prospects for U.S. agricultural exports continue to improve. The USDA has once again raised its export forecast, as we hear from the USDA's Gary Crawford.
It was a record when we estimated it back in February. It's yet a higher record now.
USDA's chief economist Seth Meyer talking about Wednesday's new USDA ag export forecast for this fiscal year, now projected at a record $164 billion, up $7 billion from USDA's last forecast 3 months ago, and an upward change of $28 billion from last year.
We can get two-thirds of that change just by adding corn and soybeans together at about $20 billion of that $28+ billion.
But the increases are showing up for many products, sending projected U.S. ag exports up 21% from last year. And Meyer says, as you might expect,
China is going to make up about $35 billion worth of those U.S. exports, far and away the number one U.S. destination for 2021.
This surge in U.S. export sales coming despite the COVID pandemic and commodity prices that have been rising for the last 9 months. Gary Crawford reporting for the U.S. Department of Agriculture.
Precision agriculture practices are having a significant benefit on farming's bottom line and also on environmental goals in the U.S. With the higher adoption rates, according to the environmental benefits of precision ag, this is a study published by the Association of Equipment Manufacturers, precision practices would result in additional, and they say significant, increases in crop production, reduced uses of herbicides and fuels, and reduced water usage. This study was co-developed with the American Soybean Association, CropLife America, and the National Corn Growers Association. The paper calculates the benefits earned from technologies, including auto guidance, section controls, variable rate telematics, and precision irrigation. It made judgments based on those technologies for productivity and for fertilizer, herbicide, fossil fuel, and water use. By leveraging the 5 precision ag technologies, this study concludes that farmers have already seen a 4% increase in production, a 7% reduction in fertilizer use, a 9% reduction in herbicide applications, a 6% reduction in fossil fuel use, and a 4% reduction in water use. Increasing adoption rates for precision ag to 90%, they say, would produce even more significant benefits. At this rate, the AEM paper reports a 6% increase in crop production, 14% reduction in fertilizer use, 15% reduction in herbicide use, a 16% reduction in fossil fuel use, and a 21% reduction in water consumption. And the number of accidents and injuries in grain bins and other confined agricultural spaces was down in 2020 compared to 2019. The number of fatalities came in below historical averages. That's according to a new report from Purdue University's Agricultural and Biological Engineering Department. The findings from Purdue show that there were 64 fatal and non-fatal incidents involving agriculture confined spaces. That represents a 4.5% decrease from 2019. The 5-year running average for all cases has decreased from its peak of nearly 76 cases per year back in 2011, according to the report. On now to this week's Kansas soybean update. Here's Greg Akagi. Greg?
Doug Bounds is joining us. He is the state statistician for USDA NASA's Kansas field office. And Doug, as we look at the latest crop update, it's been a good planting pace for Kansas soybean farmers to get their crop in.
Things have been going pretty well, at least until the rains hit. If we look at data for the week ending May 23rd, the planting progress in Kansas, soybeans were about 51% planted. That compares pretty close to last year, which was at 50%. The 5-year average, we're above that. It was at 36%. And we made progress from 43% last week.
You look at that, and then we go back to March 31st when USDA came out with their prospective plantings numbers. And what did those numbers show that Kansas soybean farmers were how many acres they were going to plant soybean-wise?
Back in March, we contacted producers across the country, and Kansas producers told us that they intended to plant 4.7 million acres of soybeans in the state. And that's down slightly, about 1% from what was planted last year.
And as we look further along here, we see the 4.7 million acres. I guess we may get further updates on that coming up on the June acreage report, which will be coming out in late June.
That's right. The prospective plantings report is just what is intended to be planted. So when June rolls around, we're going to start contacting farmers again and ask them what really got put into the ground. And so we'll contact, about 90,000 farms across the country. Roughly 5,600 of those will be here in Kansas, and get a good idea of what was actually put into the ground. And then that report will come out, as you said, on June 30th.
Being ahead of pace as they are in getting those soybeans planted, and with just 2.2 days for the week ending May 23rd of the days that farmers were able to get out into the fields, it'll be interesting to see what kind of progress as to how quickly they can get back out there and get back into full till.
Well, I've talked to a couple of farmers that are chomping at the bit to get out there. They've tried doing some spraying and some other activities. The rain has hindered that, but I think once the sun shines and the soil dries up, they'll be after it hard and fast.
And it's starting to warm up, which will help too.
Absolutely it will. I think most people are ready for a little sunshine and warm weather.
Well, Doug, we are out of time, but as always, appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Greg. I appreciate being here.
That is Doug Bounds, state statistician with USDA NASA's Kansas field office, who joins us on the Kansas Soybean Update. It's brought to you by the Kansas Soybean Commission.
Thanks, Greg. And this is Agriculture Today.
When you are in need of timely, reliable, and trusted information, K-State Research and Extension is here. Whether it's organizing people, information, or resources, they have the necessary tools. Community comes first for K-State Research and Extension. For more information and to connect with your county's extension agents, visit www.ksre.k-state.edu.
For you now on Agriculture Today, our weekly horticulture segment, and what to do about those bagworm populations, not only on evergreen trees now, but on deciduous ornamentals as well. Most trees, as a matter of fact, can harbor these pests. We've invited over from the Kansas Forest Service here at Kansas State University, Ryan Armburst. Ryan, the Forest Health Coordinator with the service. Ryan, when we talk with your colleagues in horticulture about these, they are commonplace, but they can be aggressive on a wide spectrum of trees, we find out.
Yeah, absolutely. You could find a bagworm about anything that bagworm can chew on. We're most concerned with them on tree species that don't regrow a lot of needles from dormant wood, which is usually our evergreens, junipers and spruce, arborvitae, things like that. But you'll absolutely find bagworms on everything green.
It's hard to imagine that there's somebody out there that wouldn't know what we're talking about when we discuss bagworms. But for the record, what about this pest?
Yeah, so sometimes actually we get confused and people will refer to fall webworms as a bagworm because they create a webbing or a net that sometimes looks like a bag in a tree, specifically black walnuts. But what we're talking about is a bagworm. It's a moth that actually the injurious phase of this critter is the caterpillar, and it will create really like a little cocoon or a bunker around itself made up of plant material it's chewed on, and it'll look like tiny little cones. And you'll often find trees that have significant populations of these have all these pendulous little bags that are about 1 inch to 2 inches long hanging off it, especially in the winter. They're very noticeable at that time of year.
And they're more than just a cosmetic issue, though. They will inflict damage.
Absolutely. The sort of severity of that damage is going to depend on the tree's ability to regrow that lost leaf surface area. So they'll chew on a lot of things. The amount of that damage is just, we could think of it as a stressor, and trees that cannot regrow that leaf surface area as easily are going to obviously be more heavily stressed than a tree that can easily regrow a lot of leaves, like most of our deciduous trees, which are adapted to losing those leaves every year anyway.
Then the time frame for their activity, we're just about to get into that, right?
Yeah, so when most people notice the bagworms is usually when they've already been feeding quite a bit. So at the end of summer is where really when you start to see the bagworms, because they're much larger, you see the defoliation, you see the thinning leaves and the thinning canopy on a tree. But really they're going to start showing up very soon here. They're dependent on growing degree days, so we need to have enough warm days for these eggs to hatch out of the overwintering cocoons. And actually, you'll have many small, about 1/8 of an inch long caterpillars that'll start crawling around the needles here very soon. At the very end of May, beginning of June is usually when we start to see these show up. And they begin feeding now, although we don't really see them until they're larger in the season later. And they'll continue feeding up through basically the end of summer into early fall, when they do then sort of go dormant and pupate over the winter. And the females then will hang on the tree and have those eggs that will hatch again in the spring and continue this seasonal life cycle. So it's one generation per year.
Now, bagworms can be treated, but one need be diligent about that, right?
Absolutely, and there's really, unfortunately, no silver bullet for treating these things. Combination of hand-picking the bags off of the trees, especially before they hatch in the spring, is going to really reduce your population. If you're looking for chemical treatment, obviously when the bagworms are smaller, they're going to be much more susceptible to mortality from that chemical treatment. And we're looking at repeat applications. Usually when most people see these, again, later in the summer when they're larger, that's the time they're going to be most difficult to treat because they have that cocoon around them that really causes them to not be as susceptible to those chemical insecticides.
So when you say repeat, you are talking about a fairly regular interval.
Yeah, generally. Some of the most effective insecticides we can use against these bagworms are the selective ones like BT or spinosad, which I really like because they really only control caterpillars. They're not going to have an impact on some of your beneficial insects, your predatory insects. Unfortunately, those same chemicals do break down into light. They can be washed off by rain. They need to be ingested by the bagworms to be effective. And bagworms don't all emerge at the exact same time. They don't all come out on the same day. You can have bagworms emerging for a number of weeks. So we really recommend scouting for those bagworms. As soon as you see them when they're very small, begin treatment and maybe treat even 4 or 5 times on a weekly basis throughout that, usually the month of June.
When we think about smaller ornamental plants, bagworms may be somewhat handy to deal with. But you get into your more sizable trees, whether they be landscape ornamentals, whether they be part of a windbreak, perhaps. Now it's a bigger challenge in dealing with these.
Absolutely. Most people can pick all the bags off of a small shrub that's maybe 4 or 5 feet tall. That's not a big challenge. But when you start thinking about a windbreak made up of 30-foot tall trees, obviously that's not a good option for hand picking those off. And even attempting to spray and get good coverage on that can be quite a bit of challenge. You're not going to get that with a backpack pump-up sprayer. You're just not simply going to get the coverage of insecticide on that entire tree's canopy. So at that point, you really need to consider, I would say, 2 things. One is the level of infestation by the bagworms really causing an economic impact. Is it causing a level of stress on that windbreak that really is going to justify the cost of treatment there? Because it will be costly. And if it is, you're going to need to consider hiring a professional contractor to do that sort of work. Obviously, a certified applicator who's got commercial-size spray equipment to get a good spray coverage throughout the canopy of that large tree.
Many of the deciduous trees can weather a bagworm infestation fairly well?
They can. Like I said, you'll see them show up on many things. We tend to be more concerned about them showing up on evergreen or coniferous trees. So if you have a Christmas tree farm, if you have a coniferous windbreak, if you have a high-value evergreen ornamental in your yard, these are good candidates to consider for treatment because unchecked bagworm populations on those can really do some significant damage. If you have an oak or if you have a crabapple, if you have any other sort of deciduous ornamental tree, you'll certainly see some bagworms show up on it, and it can be concerning to see these on there. But generally, we don't see bagworms be able to sort of take down those trees by themselves. They can cause some stress, but they're not enough on their own to take down one of those trees.
So weigh everything carefully there. But point is, right now is the time to be watchful for bagworm activity, and in particular, if you've had a history of this pest in the past.
Absolutely, because if you've had it bad the last few years and you have a number of sort of an egg source out there, one bag can have 500 or 1,000 eggs in it. So if you had a large population last year and you don't do anything about it, you can expect to have probably a large population this year as well.
And there is a very good updated K-State publication on bagworms, an insect pest in trees and shrubs, with all the advice on identification and the treatment protocol that'll work the best against these as we get into the late spring and very soon early summer. Ryan, thanks for reminding us of what to do about this pest.
Thanks for having me.
Ryan Armburst from the Kansas Forest Service here at Kansas State University, Forest Health Coordinator with that service on this week's horticulture segment. And that caps off our Thursday edition. Thanks for tuning in. Please rejoin us right here tomorrow. Until then, Eric Atkinson for Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network.